You are watching The Next Step. My name is Bud Booth. My co-host is Glenn Maurer. And our subject today is the war on drugs. And as our viewing audience will know, our wars on various things have been failures, and the war on drugs is no exception. It has been a failure since we are trying to eliminate drugs, and just past experience should tell that that's just not possible to do. If there's money in it, there's going to be drugs produced, whether it's locally, the designer type drug, or coming in from foreign countries such as heroin and cocaine, and some marijuana. But we can make marijuana our own country. Let me just go through some of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about availability, talk about profitability, cost to the governments, federal, state, and local, and then hopefully some solutions. But I could go to the very end and say the conclusion is that the war on drugs as now being worked on is a complete failure. So, on the availability of drugs, Glenn, do you want to start out by giving your thoughts on where it's available from and why, and anything that can be done?
Well, I think your points are, of course, exactly right. The attempts to the idea of the war on drugs, which began officially, I think, back in 1980s. Richard Nixon called it the war on drugs, and we had this idea that we were going to stop drugs from coming into the country and stop people from using drugs, illicit drugs, and get that market. It's also a cover, and we may not go into that today, but in my opinion, it was a cover for American intervention in South American and Central American countries, which were the alleged big suppliers. And so, yeah, we do have that.
Excellent point.
Cocaine, of course, is mainly out of Central America, North and South America. Marijuana, a lot of it comes from the Central America, but as you say, a huge domestic supply exists. Heroin and opiums come from the Near East. Our invention in Afghanistan over the last 20 years has seen us on both sides of that. Or, we actually were involved with, against the Soviets, we supported the cocaine growers, who were the Mujahideen, the fighters, the indigenous fighters, Taliban, who were fighting the Soviets. And then when now we're trying to destroy it there ostensibly, because the people they're the same Taliban, it's the same people that we no longer want in power. But yeah, we've got ambivalent attitudes about this. But altogether, in the 25 or 30 years that this war on drug has gone on, it's been, I guess the best test of whether it was successful or not is what has the effect been, and has it reduced the amount of drugs in the country? And the answer is no. In fact, I thought a statistic I saw just the other day, in the last year, the retail price of a gram of cocaine, which is one of the major bad drugs that we are trying to suppress, has gone from it was $177 according to the Department of Drug Enforcement, agency. So it's gone from that price to a price that is 74% cheaper than it was 30 years ago. So that price that it's charging in 30 years, working. Yeah, we actually reduced the price of the drugs it was harder to get back then and more difficult to get back then than it is today after this 30 years of war, of drugs. The use of opiates has increased by 35% in the decade between 1998 and 2008, which are the most recent statistics. So again, a failure. They've actually, it's not led to a reduction in the use of certain kinds of drugs, some of the opiate drugs, which are ostensibly the most damaging. Cocaine has increased by 27%, and cannabis, marijuana, only by 8 or so percent. But all of them have gone up, despite this ostensible war and despite the huge costs we're spending.
You see these helicopters flying over with dropping men down and then put bundles of marijuana on, And just think of what that's costing us to do that. And just as quickly as they destroy a bunch of it, they're in the process of growing it, and not just in the forests in the public lands, but also as just recently they found a big field of marijuana growing in the Lompoc area.
Oh yeah.
So
Well, it's it's a weed. I mean, it's not called weed by accident. It's basically when the white people came to this country, marijuana type plants, cannabis type plants, were growing all over the country, randomly. It wasn't exactly hard to find, and it grew just like other weeds would grow. So it's not a difficult plant to cultivate, and the idea that you can restrict it is absurd. But we spend. Just to make sure we're on the record on this, and most people maybe know these numbers, but it's still stunning if you say it out loud. $51 billion a year in this war on drugs, every year. And it goes up because of inflation and other efforts. But $51 billion, and you imagine what that money would do in other ways if we could use it for some other purpose.
if for nothing else, to tell and educate the young people that the problems with drugs, that it's destroying the health of people. It's actually destroying the life of many people.
Well, some drugs are more dangerous than others, of course, but the drugs that kill the most people in this country every year are prescribed drugs. Is abuse of prescribed medications.
Yeah, I was going to mention that.
Accidental overdose and otherwise.
Not only is that, but also these so-called designer drugs, the methamphetamines, which can be produced just anywhere and are produced all throughout the country. I think they said Iowa has more labs for producing methamphetamine than anywhere else. And
Oregon, California, the West Coast.
That it would be more on the coast, the East Coast and West Coast.
Sorry, but the point also, I still want to make the point that legitimate, quote unquote, pharmaceuticals, drugs that are made by big name pharmaceutical companies, kill over 30,000, 31,000 people a year in this country because they're either misused or abused or overdosed on, whereas the amount of people who die from these other drugs is much smaller.
Yeah.
Nobody died last year or last decade from marijuana. Nobody died from that.
Yeah.
And then of course, in terms of alcohol, it's even grossly greater. So the ostensible rationale for the war on drugs, that it somehow was a threat to the safety of society, was never quite true.
Yeah.
It was never quite true. It had to do with other agendas, and some of it was racist, and some of it was others. But we need to back away from that. Have some education. In the 30s, even in the 30s, there were studies that said that marijuana, for example, should not be included on the schedule of highest level of prosecution drugs that the federal government had created in the turn of this last century, and that was laughed out by the law enforcement people who said these are just softies. Mayor LaGuardia, I think, of New York, had a famous commission in the 30s that came out with a report saying that they should decriminalize marijuana. Imagine what would happen if they'd done that.
Yeah. We just look how much better off the country would be if they had. And well, as you pointed out, marijuana is, well, actually, it's not nearly as addictive as tobacco. Cigarettes are.
Yeah. It's not the best thing in the world, perhaps, to use, and there are complaints about some parts of it, and certainly it's not good to hold this type of stuff in your lungs. I mean, there's all kinds of issues about health issues, but it's not nearly as destructive to society as the loss of that $51 billion a year that could be spent on more productive things, and it's not nearly as, and the 100, we had last year 758,000 people arrested for marijuana crimes last year in this country, almost all of which were from possession.
We hadn't mentioned yet the cost of putting the people in prison.
Right.
In prison for marijuana, just the use of marijuana, a person goes to jail, and it's not going to help alleviate the problem to have them in jail and then out and then reusing it again. Whereas if that money was spent to educate the people, that they best spend their money for other good things.
Well, yeah, and it's a lesson we have been taught this lesson before, and yet we refuse to listen to the lesson that we know. When Prohibition existed, it was a great experiment. Prohibition was a great experiment. I think it was well-intentioned because alcohol was destroying families and societies in the United States for various reasons. And the evil that had come from alcohol addiction and alcoholism and all the other things that were associated with that, and the unregulated nature of the industry and all that, was bad. But it created a worse problem, as we all know. I mean, it's a basic truth of our society that the first gang warfare, serious gang warfare, and the first high crime began in the 20s as people fought over the lucrative alcohol trade.
Exactly.
And the point that people don't pay attention to is the biggest decline in crime in the history of this country in terms of since they kept records was after they legalized alcohol. After they legalized and regulated alcohol, crime went down the most rapidly and the longest than it ever had before in this country and since, although it's continuing to go down again now. But so we were paying a high price in crime, in incarceration, in enforcement, in all the penal systems, and all the costs, and instead they regulated it. And when they regulated it, they got tax revenues. You were able to control who got it more, and where it was sold, and how it was marketed. And the country did accomplish some of the goals that Prohibition was intended.
Yeah. Yeah. So we covered both the designer drugs and prescription drugs, which are, as Glenn just pointed out, prescription drugs are more misused than are the so-called illegal drugs. And if kids can get their hands on prescription drugs, they have no medical indication of what it's going to do to their body. Yeah. And it can be very disastrous.
Well, 32,000 people a year overdose and other deaths associated with prescribed drugs. It's a lot more than from illicit drugs.
We've already talked about the profitability. Because they are illegal, the profit the cost of it will go way down. I think Glenn pointed out the figures on how much less expensive the drugs are now than they were earlier, which indicates that more people are using them.
There's more demand, more profit,
yes.
And they keep bringing them in, and they bring them in such volume that they actually have reduced the price. Yeah. They're oversaturating the market.
Yeah.
By conversely, if we were to legalize and regulate these drugs, it's estimated by serious economists who understand these things, and I think they're probably going to be wrong to some percentage or another, but they estimate if we taxed currently illegal drugs in the same fashion we tax alcohol, we would generate about $46 or $47 billion a year in tax income revenues. So you offset the 51 billion and you add 47 billion, you have a net gain of almost $100 billion to be used for better purposes. And if you have alcohol abuse, or you have drug abuse, or you have other things, you can do like the European countries have done, provide care and treatment facilities, and get people out of it.
When are we going to learn, as you just pointed out, that these drugs are, the marijuana particularly, but also heroin and cocaine, are less regulated and less criminalized in European countries than they are here. And yet people are not susceptible to debilitating illnesses because of drugs.
It's a mixed experience with the European countries, but within the ones that completely try to hands-off libertarian, no rules approach did have some problems, not nearly what kind of problems we have in terms of cost. I mean, putting a person in prison is a devastating experience for the person that you're putting in prison. 87% of the people arrested for marijuana, as I mentioned, are for possession alone, use, possession and use. And so these are people who are just substance abusers, if you want to use that phrase, or users, and they're going to go in prison and have devastating experiences. Alternatively, we can do like Portugal, which about 4 years ago legalized all drugs, or decriminalized. They didn't legalize. They decriminalized all drugs, and a person who's arrested for abusing heroin or opiates or other opiates or marijuana or any other, amphetamines or whatever, is taken into a program and held in or structured in a structured program in which they are given an opportunity to get quote unquote better, or to get a better attitude about how to deal with these kind of substances. Much better experience, less expensive, certainly more beneficial to society as a whole, and they've been doing it now for 4 or 5 years very successfully.
And it should be pointed out that more and more states and also the federal government are permitting people to use marijuana as a medicinal product, and that has helped. And people constantly are saying how the marijuana that they use, whether it be in a cookie or whether it be in a cigarette, it has helped them.
Absolutely, for nausea and chemotherapy and
it should
pain
also be
relief.
pointed out that the state of Colorado and Washington have legalized the recreational use
Right.
of marijuana. And I foresee that this is something that will spread to other states. I'm surprised we haven't done it here in
Well,
California.
it almost did it in California in the last election, but the law and order forces came in. You remember, we talked on our last show, the prison industrial complex, about how there's a huge lobby of people who build prisons and the prison guards and others who want to see these institutions used, and they want to have their staff. And so it's hard to get past that economic interest to do what needs to be done. But marijuana was only included in this federal high schedule classification by accident, by mistake, and as I say, partly on a racist term because it was thought to be the drug of the black underclass and whatever. But yes, we should decriminalize, and I think the Colorado and Washington models are the adult and more respectable way of going about this. And what it'll bring about is some ability to regulate and package and sell this substance in a way that's reliable. Right now, I mean, one of the problems is that the purveyors of these substances, I mean, they can make very potent cannabis that's so potent you can hallucinate from it, or they can make cannabis that's just mild and pleasant and makes you feel better. And so it's like buying 200 proof alcohol or a 3% beer.
Yeah.
And we need to have that ability to know what it is that's being sold, to whom it's being sold, and to be able to trust what's out there.
Excellent point.
And I think that needs to be done, just as an adult society would do that.
Yeah.
And then it would get away from this fringy element. I know, I guess in the 20s it was glamorous to go to a speakeasy or have some special place that you bought your booze, but it wasn't healthy.
Yeah, right. Well, the next thing I had down, well, profitability, and we've really discussed that particularly for prison guards, they make big salaries, and they keep, as long as drugs are filling up the prisons, they're going to keep fighting to have them stay illegal.
Well, if you have half of your inmate population, which are basically drug users and even drug dealers, they're relatively benign compared to who should be in prisons, in my opinion. I mean, who should be in the high security prisons? They should be the most violent, the most difficult people. Well, guards don't want a prison full of that population. They would rather have a little more tractable population. But it's extremely expensive. It's $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year minimum to keep a person in prison in California. You could send them to college for that same amount of money and have a much better result.
Yeah, and then when that person is in prison just for the possession of it, when he gets out, he's got a black mark on his record.
Wow.
It's going to be hard for him to get a legal job. So he's going to go right back to doing what he did before,
Right.
which may even move into selling.
Well, he learned, I mean, he or she, but generally speaking, it's going to be a he. He learned in prison that, how to survive among this culture. I mean, one of the things that prisons do, it's like Fagan
They're good
School for
educators.
Scoundrels. You mentioned that when you get out of prison with a prison record, the chance of getting employment is reduced dramatically, especially in this economy where people have a hard time finding any work, and the employers can choose. And then secondly, they're going to be associated with the contacts and the friends and the people they hung out with in prison. So they're going to even be more likely to engage in underground or high-risk occupations than they would have been. So we teach people in prison how to deal in illegal activities.
They're the ones that go in for the first time are students to the old timers that have
Right.
been in a number of times and have all the solutions to.
Well, they have a way of, they have a culture. They have a social culture that exists, and you're indoctrinated into that culture and become a part of it, partly because there's not another culture that'll accept you outside of the prisons. One of the things we might want to talk about is a little bit about, outside the United States, the effect of this war on drugs. I mean, the thing that strikes me is this absurdity that's going on in Mexico right now. I mean, 70,000 people have been killed in the last decade, less than a decade, in the narco wars.
That's all for the money they get for getting the drugs to the United States, and they fight among themselves. The various warlords down in drug lords down in Mexico are fighting with each other for and killing, as you pointed out. What was it, 50,000?
I think it's 70,000, yeah.
70,000.
Since 2000, number I had here, since 2006, it was over 70,000 people. And it doesn't seem like it's abating. And then when we have a conservative president of Mexico talk about legalizing or decriminalizing marijuana and some other drugs in his own country as a way of removing the profit motive from this trafficking, we have American foreign policy saying you can't do that because we give you money to fight these narcotics traffickers, and you can't have that money if you don't, and we're also going to frown on you. And so the United States has taken a position that basically reinforces this narco war down there, and it's again, we're doing the same thing in Colombia. Ostensibly, partly it was because we could support the conservative government against the guerrillas who were left and socialist, and even, I don't know if they were communist or not, but they were certainly more of the people's view, more left view, and that allowed us to support their right-wing business interests against them, and it gave us a alleged purpose in bringing in what was essentially a military operation. I mean, we brought in all kinds of militarism into that country. So the American foreign policy has been co-opted with with the war on drugs. And
the last thing I have down is solutions. I think we've been
Sure.
kind of giving the solutions as we've been elucidating the problems of the war on drugs. And I used medication of it as medication for pain. I talked about decriminalizing, as Washington and Colorado have done for marijuana, and then we can, if we completely decriminalize marijuana, then we can concentrate on educating to stop the production of cocaine and heroin coming from places that we can't do it, and we still have the problem of the designer drugs that can be produced here in this country and are increasing in the number of people that use methamphetamines over the heroin and cocaine, because it's possible to produce in this country and there's no middleman to take profits out.
Well, yeah, one thing I think that the public and we in this panel and the public and society needs to stop and pay attention to. And this is something that we tend not to do. Every society in the course of human history has had some type of substance abuse relief, has some type of substance they took to escape the pain and grinding and other experiences of reality. Every society, whether you smoke peyote or whether you drink wine or beer beer in Egypt and wine in every society, opium. Every society has always had some escapism. It's a natural part, and to try to suppress and pretend that you can eliminate that is naive. You know, thousands of years of human history say you're not going to stop a portion of society from trying to find this type of relief. So we need to start with that premise, I think. And then we need to say, well, which of these things are really threatening and to how many people? So if alcohol is threatening and a percentage of people who consume alcohol, 10% or whatever it might be, are going to abuse it, do you try to stop 90% from having it, or do you address the 10%? Mm-hmm. And if you regulate and tax and control how that is marketed, and in California they say that if we legalized marijuana and sold it, it would make about $1.7 billion a year in tax revenues for the state. If you took half of that money and gave it for the regulatory agencies, and half of that money and gave it to substance abuse and other care facilities, wouldn't we be a better off society?
Absolutely.
Than we are right now?
Absolutely.
And then the other thing I think we need to think is there tends to be a boogeyman approach. So when a new drug comes along, it's like, oh my God, this is the worst drug that's ever been known to humankind. And they would do these movies in the 20s and 30s and 40s showing people smoking marijuana, killer weed. And they're hilarious movies to look at today. But people who watch those movies actually believe that if you smoked marijuana, you would become a agitated, crazed, aggressive, knife-stabbing. They show this in the movies. I've seen these films. And so, we need a more analytical attention to what is the danger of marijuana, what is the danger of cocaine, what is the danger of heroin. One of the things that when I did my public defender life, and in my early years, I had grown up with this idea that heroin was basically a killer. If anybody took heroin, they would be dead in 3 months in a flop house somewhere. And I found that there were people who used heroin for 20 and 30 and 40 years. The alcoholics were dying much faster than people with using heroin. So isn't it maybe better to give people a little access to heroin and let them live it than to exclude them? Go ahead.
I did want to take just a few seconds here to thank our tri-producers, Allie Adamick, Juanita Chatham, and Liz Burke, for the work they do in the control room. And without them, this program would not be on the air, we hope. And also want to thank our viewing audience for following along with us.